Now, if you're writing an academic paper in English, structuring that work can be a huge challenge because it really requires us to take a step back from what we're writing about and try to understand higher level structures, a little bit more abstract way of framing or organizing the work that you're doing here. And so what I want to try to give you is a few tips about how you can do that really, really effectively. And when I think about a thesis or almost any academic writing, I really think of it in three parts. I think about why is that piece of work relevant? I think about how I have kind of conducted that research. And then I think what have I specifically done? So why, how, what? I think this gives us a good overarching structure. High level. Now that you can break down further. And when I talk about writing for academic English, I'm really thinking about social science, but you could also translate this to other disciplines. Computer science uses this structure a lot. Health sciences uses a lot. Education sciences, there's a lot of different fields that use this basic structure. So maybe take it with a little bit of grain of salt here. Your disciplinary field might differ a little bit. I know law and legal studies, the writing structure is a lot different than social science. I know that I don't know, maybe you come from an anthropological background, might be a little bit different. I'm pretty sure that the science like physics and chemistry and things like that more or less follow this structure as well. So anything that uses empirical research, I think, would more or less follow the structure, which is introduction, literature review, methodology, results and analysis, discussion, and conclusion. Now, their little middle part here, the results and analysis and discussion, is a little bit flexible. You might break the results out and then the analysis in a separate section and then the discussion in a separate section. You might combine analysis and discussion and then have that as its own section, or you might combine discussion and conclusion and have it as its own section. Regardless, introduction, literature review, methodology, results and analysis, that's the way I typically do it. Discussion, conclusion, that should be your structure, if you can think of it on that level. So highest level, why, how, what, kind of secondary level, as I just described. So your why sets up more or less your introduction and your literature review. What a why does is it justifies why your research is relevant. So if you can't do that by the time you're done with your introduction and your literature review, for me, if I'm reviewing your paper, you've already failed because you've already lost my interest. You've already lost the relevance of why I care about this work. And it's really important that you're able to do that as a scientist, because justifying why your research is important is critical to whether or not you'll get grant funding, whether or not you get your publication published. It's not good enough to just say it's important because I think it's important or because I'm a genius and I have really big thoughts. You've got to show to your readers, the people who are supposed to build off of your work, why your research is important and why it's relevant. So let's start off with the why, literature review and introduction. How have you conducted your research? Well, that's more or less just the methodology. Maybe the analysis is a little bit part of the how, it's the procedure, but methodology kind of covers it. And then what did you come up with? Well, I think what is more or less covered by those last few sections. So results, analysis, discussion, and conclusion, that's your what. That's the meat. That's the kind of the main aspect of your research. That's the empirics behind your research. So I think of structure and organization of a thesis or a piece of academic writing in those terms: introduction, literature review, methods, results and analysis, discussion, and conclusion. Now I'm going to go through each of those sections separately in a separate video, so check them out if that's something you want to kind of do a deeper dive on. But right now we're just focusing on structure and organization. Now, when it comes to organizing the sections, so you're organizing, say, your literature review, I always try to make sure that the ideas start from broad, from like the most abstract level, and go to the most concrete level. Now, the literature review is a great way, great kind of example or case study of how we can structure our writing, because the literature review should more or less feed the reader. It should channel the reader right into into the methodology, which should be directly related to your topic of interest. So if what your literature review does is take me from idea A to B to C to D that are kind of linked but don't have a clear flow that is driving the reader into the methodology, then all it's going to read, all the reviewer is going to do when they read it is just kind of get bounced around from idea to idea. It's fine, I suppose, but I think it's mediocre writing. So think about each section in your literature review, each kind of topic that you want to deal with, and structure it in a way that you deal with the most abstract, the highest level ideas at the beginning of the literature review, which in some ways kind of sets up the justification for your thesis, because you're going to talk about the science behind each of these topics. And then you kind of step them down into more and more narrow ideas and narrow pieces of work. Now, what you may find in doing that is that the first section of your literature review is really theoretical. It may deal with a lot of models and theories around the topic, your topic of interest. And then as you step down gradually, you may find that there's less and less research that's available, that's been conducted on this topic, until you get to the point of your thesis or your piece of academic writing, which is supposed to be making a new contribution to this field. So the new contribution is a really important part, because if you're just kind of restating what somebody else has already said, that's not a new contribution. So as you get to your work, your contribution to the field, the topics that deal specifically with that should become, the research behind that should be less and less and less. So you'll probably find that on the highest level, there's a lot more citations, and then as you get to the lowest level, your last section or even your last couple of paragraphs in your literature review may only have 1 or 2 citations. That's fine. That's what you want, because you're leading the reader, you're kind of drawing them into, this is why my research is so relevant and important, why what I've done matters. Now, each section, I think of a section, so let's go back to the literature review. I think of that section more or less as having 2 to 3 headings underneath it. And then maybe each of those headings, depending on the length of your overall kind of manuscript, the length of your overall document, each of those headings might have 2 to 3 subheadings. But the rule of thumb here is 2 to 3. When I find that each heading has like 7 subheadings, I think, well, maybe the writer didn't organize themselves well enough. Maybe there are some subheadings that they could have included or combined or somehow organized it a little bit better. I think the 2 to 3 rule kind of gives the reader a really good, clear understanding of what to expect, and how it forces you as the writer to organize yourself a little bit better. So 2 to 3 subheadings, and then if you have under each subheading, or under each heading, if you have a subheading, then 2 to 3 subheadings. And then for each subheading or each heading, anywhere you're writing actual text, as I mentioned in the video on how to write, you really want 3 or 4 paragraphs max. Now you can go as low as 2, I would be fine with 2. You can go as high as maybe 5. But if I start seeing 7 paragraphs under a heading, then I'm like, well, there's probably a lot more here that you could have, a lot better ways of organizing this that you could have done than just giving me a whole lot of information. And if you do less than 2, if you do 1 paragraph, then I think, well, okay, this might be something you could have talked about further, you could have been more clear about, or it's something that could be combined into a different section. 2 to 3 headings, 2 to 3 subheadings, and if you go subheadings, fine, 2 to 3 of them. 3 to 4 paragraphs in each heading. I think that's where your real substance of your work can be, how you can organize the substance of your writing. Now, last thing I want to deal with here about organization is constructing a narrative throughout your thesis. And this is a really challenging piece of writing. I had a hard time with this when I first started academic writing. Creating a clear narrative throughout the whole of a document, throughout the whole of a piece of work, was just a huge challenge, because I wanted to talk about so many different things, because there were so many awesome things that were related to my work. When you're constructing your narrative, it's really important that you get comfortable leaving things on the shelf, leaving things on the cutting room floor, as it were. And not including every possible thing into your thesis. So you might end up with a literature review where you want to cover 10 topics. Well, that's probably not relevant. There's probably a few of them that aren't relevant. I would say over half that probably aren't relevant. So really think critically about what it is that is the most important aspects of your work and focus only on those things. If it doesn't fall into that most important aspect, then it doesn't belong in your thesis. It belongs in a different thesis, or it belongs in another piece of work that you can write. So when you're setting up the introduction, you're talking about things like your aims and your objectives of your work. You might want to just write that down and keep it next to your computer, because that is your guide. That's your guide throughout your whole thesis. That's your guide for how you're structuring your thesis. So any of the headings or subheadings that you're trying to write, look at your aim of your thesis, or maybe look at your research question and say, does this heading belong with this? Not does it relate, because there's a million topics that relate to to a single idea, but does it belong? Is it directly connected to this piece of work? And even if it's directly connected, is the connection as strong as these other ideas that I want to deal with? So really be critical about what belongs and doesn't belong in your thesis, and be very, very comfortable tossing things out. I just use my gut instinct, right? So if I'm kind of structuring things and I'm looking at all the different topics I want to cover, if it just hits me as this might not be so related, get rid of it. You can always add it back, but try and really challenge yourself to just focus on a few things rather than a lot of things. Focus on the things that are most directly related, or maybe even set up a kind of criteria where you're looking at, say, all the topics you want to cover in your literature review, or even all of the results that you've found, and say, okay, here's my objective of my paper. This topic, this topic, this topic, rank them most applicable to least applicable, and do the same thing maybe in your results or whatever else you're working on. I think that can really help you structure your writing. It can help you craft that narrative, that red thread, and help you focus on what it is that matters. Now you might find that, all 30 of these topics deal with my aim or my objective, fine. Or maybe all 30 of those are equally weighted, they all equally deal. Maybe your objective is too broad. Focus your objective, and then you'll find that you'll be able to create a clearer narrative. So, number one, on the highest level, make sure that you can justify why your research is relevant, how you've conducted it, and what you have found. Structure your document into these parts: introduction, literature review, methods, results, analysis, discussion in some shape or form, and your conclusion. Make sure you're organizing your sections into 2 to 3 headings, or 2 to 3 subheadings, and your headings and subheadings into 3 to 4 paragraphs. And then make sure that you have a very clear narrative that relates to your topic, relates to your aim, that's throughout the whole thesis, and don't be afraid of getting rid of stuff that doesn't belong.